Well, a very good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's Lancaster University public lecture, which today is being hosted as part of the Bay International Film Festival. And we're delighted to have representatives there, and there is even a stand that you can go and see and learn more about the wonderful Bay International Film Festival after the talk. My name's Andy Schofield. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of Lancaster University. And that is why it is a particular pleasure to welcome you here this evening. And if you're an aficionado of these or even just here for your first time, in either case, we are delighted to welcome you here on a cold evening outside, but a warm evening inside. And we have what I think will be a real treat. We're delighted to welcome our speaker, Professor Sir Christopher Frayling, a cultural historian, an educationalist, a critic, a writer, the author of more than, I think, 25 books and two more in close production, numerous articles. He's done exhibition catalogues on contemporary and modern art, design, and film. He's presented television series. He is Professor Emeritus, having retired just this summer from Lancaster University's Institute for the Contemporary Arts. But it's a retirement that is clearly highly productive with books on the way, and we're clearly also getting our money's worth out of him by giving him the opportunity to speak to us today. And it's a talk which, well, I won't preempt, but I think it will give us a fascinating glimpse through cinematic history and also his own personal history over many decades. If, as I hope, the talk gives answers but also inspires more questions, then do please hold those thoughts, because afterwards Sir Christopher is willing to give opportunity, and indeed I think wants to put some grit out there to seed some pearls in terms of questions and conversation afterwards. So there'll be opportunity for questions with a roving mic coming at the end. So Christopher, it's an honour to have you here tonight, and I won't delay your talk any longer, but will invite you to come up onto the stage and give your talk entitled Real Conversations.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you, Andy. Thanks to the Bay International Film Festival for inviting me, and thank you all for coming this evening. A few years ago at the Royal College of Art, where I used to teach, a famous philosopher from Oxford came to give a series of 4 lectures to the students on visual thinking. And we thought it would be a good idea to have the painting and fine art students in the audience. And he came and gave his first lecture, which was very dense, lots of quotations in foreign languages, no pictures, which is fatal. And there were 20 students, which was the full complement. At his second lecture of 4, there were 10 students. At his third lecture, there were 5, and at his final lecture, there was 1 solitary student. And so the philosopher from Oxford turned to the student and said, there's not much point in going on with this. Why don't we just have a cup of tea and talk about it? To which the student replied, I do wish you would go on. I've been trying to draw you for 4 weeks. I've actually spent my professional career trying to build bridges between that philosopher and that young artist. And it's partly what this lecture is going to be about. The gulf that sometimes exists between the practitioners in an area, in this case film, and the theorizing, and how do you build bridges between the two of them? In some ways, this is a farewell lecture, and in some ways, as Andy said, it's the first. It's my farewell lecture with the University of Lancaster after 13 years as a professor teaching and researching film and design, but it's my first lecture ever as a professor emeritus at Lancaster. So anyway, I've called it Real Conversations, and what I'm going to be doing is to look back and share some of the encounters I've had, some of them close encounters, some of them more distant, with various directors, actors, and production designers. And I call them conversations. In some ways they were interviews, but I've always thought that a conversational style in dealing with these things is the way to get the best out of people rather than an inquisition. So I like to think of them as conversations, and I approach them as an arts educator, very interested in the visual side of things, as a broadcaster, because you may remember those dim and distant days when BBC television did seasons of films. You remember the films of a director or the films of an actor, and they'd head up that season with an interview with the protagonist, which I did for several years. So some of my conversations were with people in preparation for those. As a film critic and curator, as Andy has said, sometimes doing conversations which would appear in a gallery as part of an exhibition. But above all, as an academic, teaching and researching in film studies. And I say, trying to bridge those two worlds. Here's the world of writing about film in academic circles for university presses, and here's the world of giving these conversations. How do you actually square that circle? So I'm going to be reminiscing about the background to the conversation and thinking about what I learned from them. The main characters, in order of appearance, are going to be, it's rather dangerous saying this because you'll probably be looking forward to one and won't listen to the others. But anyway, Alfred Hitchcock is coming up, first of all, who needs no introduction. And then T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, that's the real one, rather than the film one. He makes an appearance. And then Doris Day. And I'm not sure about the demographic of this audience, but some will need a footnote, which is that she was America's most popular movie star from the middle 50s to the mid 60s, with a whole series of films which were hugely popular. In fact, when Barbie dolls first started, they were associated in the public mind with Rock Hudson and Doris Day rather than Barbie and Ken. It was so deeply embedded in popular culture. So anyway, Doris Day. Ken Adam, the designer of the early James Bond films, 7 of them, and 2 of Stanley Kubrick's greatest films, including The War Room in Dr. Strangelove. I wrote 3 books with Ken, and the interviews are partly about taking production design more seriously. And finally, as a climax, my conversation with Clint Eastwood for an exhibition I curated called Once Upon a Time in Italy, when in California. And he didn't particularly want to talk about Italian westerns, but we did. And as I say, there are various matters arising from these that I'd like to start with before we get on with the clips and talking about them. There is always the danger of projecting the latest thesis in film studies and publications onto the subject of the interview, as I say, with the academic world and the film world, onto subjects who simply didn't think about things quite like that, and certainly didn't express them quite like that. And if you approach that too directly, it was liable to lead to an embarrassing silence. And I wanted the conversations to be archival as much as possible, to appeal to film buffs as well as academics. But how do you weave difficult concepts into these conversations in a way that actually appeals to the subject and they don't clam up? And the classic example of this is the book Hitchcock, Truffaut, which some of you may know, which is the template for all film interviews, published in 1966 in France and 1967 in England. And it's a week-long interview between the French director François Truffaut and Alfred Hitchcock, which took place at Universal Studios in August 1962. And there's a classic example of what I mean. François Truffaut talks about a scene in Hitchcock's The 39 Steps, 1935. And some of you may know it, Robert Donat spends the night with a suspicious Scottish crofter, played by John Laurie, and his wife, played by Peggy Ashcroft. And Truffaut talks for 25 lines in his question about how the mood of the scene reminds him of German expressionism, how the characters, he says, are bound to the earth and to religion, and about how Hitchcock uses silent film techniques to create tension. 25 lines later, Hitchcock says, "Yes, that was a nice scene," and then changes the subject. And that's not the way to do it. Truffaut was overloading the question with all sorts of assumptions that he wanted, and Hitchcock just didn't think about it in quite that way. Actually, themes like that did come through, but they didn't come through in a direct way. And I've experienced that myself. I did a televised conversation with Doris Day, and I'll be showing a clip from it a little bit later on. And I'd been reading a reappraisal of her work from a feminist perspective, a British Film Institute dossier called Move Over Misconceptions, a reference to Move Over Darling, the reference to her film. and an article called Reclaim the Day. And I asked Doris Day about how she felt about being reclaimed by the feminist movement as a strong, independent woman, career woman in film, who had all sorts of responsibilities, unlike, for example, Audrey Hepburn or Grace Kelly or Marilyn Monroe. You can't imagine them ever earning a living, and somehow she succeeded in doing that. So I asked her that. Silence. A frown. And then she said, if I understand you right, and then she changed the subject. It wasn't the way to approach it, and I hadn't learned at that stage that you have to, as I say, weave these thoughts into the conversation in a different way. And in my final clip with Clint Eastwood, you'll see me asking some obscure question about his Italian Western movies. And he says, that would be something the Cinematheque might ask. In other words, French people ask difficult questions like that, and he wasn't used to it. So that's one matter arising, is building that bridge between thinking about film and interviewing practitioners who don't necessarily think like that. In each case, I was asking the interviewee to reminisce about their past career, and probably their press agents and their main agent would much prefer them to talk about their latest project and promote it. So there's always that tension, marketing versus reminiscence. And I noticed that the interviewees were happy to talk about their back numbers so long as the agent wasn't in the room. If the agent was in the room, they're very inhibited about it, and they felt they had to go into promotional mode. Memory. Show business personalities preparing for chat shows and taped autobiographies sometimes develop a repertoire of favorite stories and anecdotes, which they've told and honed down so often that even they have come to believe them, whether or not they actually happened. And this happens a lot in show business. It's a sort of industry folklore that becomes the property of an individual. So like all oral history, when you're doing these interviews and conversations, it's essential, if you can, to compare with other witnesses, known in the trade as triangulation, either printed or oral sources, because very often these things on close inspection don't hold up. One classic example is the actor David Niven's autobiography, The Moon's a Balloon, which some of you may know, published in 1971, and especially its sequel, Bring on the Empty Horses, 1975. It's full of industry folklore, wonderful stories, and claims that they happened to him and that he was there for all of them, which in some cases he was, and in some cases he wasn't. A well-researched response was subsequently published called The Other Side of the Moon, 1985, by Sheridan Morley. And the books are entertaining, they're full of chat show anecdotes and stories, but they'd have to be taken with a very large pinch of salt. To quote the cultural theorist Walter Benjamin, it's not so much a question of how it really was, as a question of who is to take control of a memory and why, and to ask why this person thinks the story happened to them. So when conducting these conversations, it was as well to have one's critical antennae buzzing. Related to this, there's the last person standing syndrome, where the celebrity may sometimes relish being the sole survivor with no one around anymore to contradict them. And the classic example of this was the great graphic designer and poster artist Saul Bass, wonderful designer, who in a very distinguished career was pictorial consultant on Psycho, designing the credits and a number of the storyboards, including the boards for the famous shower sequence in Bates Motel. It was filmed in the same year as Spartacus, for which Saul Bass designed the wonderful opening credits, all these Roman artifacts crumbling into dust as the words appeared. And he also designed the posters and credits for North by Northwest and Vertigo. Anyway, in interviews, especially after Alfred Hitchcock died in April 1980, Bass started claiming that not only did he draw the storyboards, but he actually directed the shower sequence. And in some interviews, that Hitchcock wasn't even there. Quote, Hitchcock looked at my drawings and said, "You do it." Was Hitchcock even there? Yes, he said sometimes, but he was busy doing something else at the time on a different part of the lot. And in fact, Saul Bass said this to me in an interview, one of many that he gave, when I spent some time with him in summer 1986 at the Aspen, Colorado International Design Conference, with its theme that year of British design. But what he'd forgotten was that Janet Leigh was in fact still alive, very much alive, and she immediately contradicted Saul Bass's reminiscence. Quote, "Saul Bass never directed me, absolutely not. Hitch did." So the shower scene was directed by Alfred Hitchcock in person, closely using Saul Bass's storyboards as shot references. Remember that moment where you get the eye of Janet Leigh, which turns into the plug hole as the blood goes out? That was a storyboard moment, if ever there was one. So yes, Saul Bass thought of that, but Alfred Hitchcock shot it. And because film is such a collaborative art, there's always the temptation for key players, especially directors since the 1950s, to claim credit in interviews for all the most successful elements. And I'm afraid to say, if the film was unsuccessful, well, the director was badly advised. It can't have been their fault. And I've tried in some of my conversations to fly the flag for some other protagonists, the production designers and costume designers, as very influential members of the core team, with the writer, the director, and the director of photography. And we'll be talking about that a little bit later on. Now, the latest product syndrome and the pressures of marketing didn't apply when my interviewees were veterans, looking back on a career in the industry from a well-established position as a name above the title. But here's another theme. They may well have moved on to other things, which to them were of more immediate concern, and they wanted to talk about them, not about their films. Their films may have been the most interesting things to me, but they weren't necessarily to them. Elizabeth Taylor, say. I never interviewed her, though I did try, actually, to arrange a meeting when preparing the Hollywood costume exhibition at the V&A, shortly before she died in 2011. She wanted to use interviews and television conversations as an opportunity to draw attention to HIV and AIDS, an awareness campaign to which she was deeply committed as an activist from the 1980s onwards. And she co-founded the American Foundation for AIDS Research in 1985 and her own foundation in 1991. Or Audrey Hepburn, who became a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador with a special interest in children in developing countries, and only made occasional films after the 1960s, from Robin and Marian, 1976, through to Always in 1989. I really, really wanted to interview Audrey Hepburn because the BBC had the rights to all her key films for a season. Roman Holiday, Sabrina Fair, War and Peace, Breakfast at Tiffany's, My Fair Lady, and Two for the Road. The BBC had rights to all of them. But I couldn't get past her front office. And she'd never given a detailed freestanding interview about her film career. She'd given lots of interviews about UNICEF. And I discovered that it's a complicated story, but the girlfriend of my boss at the Royal College of Art lived in Gstaad in Switzerland for part of the year as a next-door neighbor to Audrey Hepburn. So I got her to pop through the letterbox, Audrey Hepburn's house, a request for an interview. And I got a lovely letter back saying, the next time I'm in England, I remember the BBC during the war when I was in Holland, and it helped us through the difficult times during the occupation in Holland. And the next time I'm in England, I would love to do an interview about my career. Well, that's it. She died before she came back to England. So that really was the one that got away. But her main interest by then was UNICEF. Or Doris Day, who by the 1980s was deeply committed to animal rights and animal protection. She ran her own foundation, and she ran a huge dogs home for strays in Carmel, California. And the only condition she'd do for an interview is that we had to talk about dogs for 15 minutes. I'm not an expert on dogs, and there's some terrible shots in the program of me looking very, very embarrassed as this little furry creature sort of rubs against my foot and all the rest of it. But anyway, sometimes our interest in film history is not the same as that of the interviewees. So finally, some didn't want to talk about aspects of their work at all and asked us to avoid them. Gregory Peck, for example, said he didn't want to discuss his very first film, Days of Glory, made in 1944, directed by Jacques Tourneur, in which he played a guerrilla fighter called Vladimir, who led a band of Russian guerrilla fighters against the Nazi invaders of the Soviet Union. And it was made when the Soviet Union was among the Allies during the Second World War. So did he want to avoid the subject for political reasons, I wondered. No, he said, it's because my performance was terrible, and I never went to see the finished film, and I don't want to see it now. Actually, I did manage to weave Days of Glory into the conversation, and he said some quite interesting things about it, but what he didn't want was a clip and make a big thing of it. A final theme. I learned the hard way that some questions may be cheesy, particularly if asked by a professor, but they're still worth asking. For example, when talking with Doris Day, I wanted her to sing the song Que Sera, Sera on camera. The song, which I'm sure you know, was featured in Alfred Hitchcock's remake of The Man Who Knew Too Much, 1956 remake of the 1934 film. And so I said to her, I didn't want to say directly, can you sing it for us, Doris, Miss Day? But I went round and round the houses. I said, the film, The Man Who Knew Too Much, had a song in it, didn't it? Yes, that's right. And the song became a big hit for you, didn't it? Yes, it did. And it won the Academy Award for the best song of the year. Yes. And in the film, you sing it at full volume to reassure your kidnapped son, Hank, that you're nearby. Yes, I believe I did. And at that point, the film magazine ran out. We were shooting on 60mm. And while the cameraman was changing the reel, she sang the song beautifully to the crew in the room and then burst into tears. I couldn't possibly ask her to do it again in those circumstances. And what I should have said is, look, can you sing Que Sera for us? Que Sera, Sera for us? And you could always cut out the question when you get to actually show the documentary. But I thought it was too cheesy. But I'd learned my lesson. And shortly afterwards, in an interview with Charlton Heston, for the radio this time, I went straight into it and asked him, please, to give the listeners two of his most famous lines. As Moses parting the Red Sea in the Ten Commandments, standing on a rock, behold his mighty hand, which he did, or rather, that's what he said. And as the astronaut Taylor in Planet of the Apes, 1968, spoiler alert, on seeing the Statue of Liberty poking out of the sand, we did it, we finally really did it. And I said, can you say those lines, Mr. Heston? And he did. And it was great, and the audience loved it. It was cheesy as hell, but that's what people wanted. Anyway, to the first clip. I want to take you back to 1966. I was end of first-year student at Cambridge University, and Alfred Hitchcock came to give a lecture in the Lady Mitchell Hall, which is the great lecture hall. But before I show you that clip, I want to show you the first clip, which is from his television program, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, which was screened in the 1950s and turned into the Alfred Hitchcock Hour in 1962, because Alfred Hitchcock had become the most instantly recognizable director in the world with his introductions to these programs, where he would appear and make some lugubrious jokes written for him by a man called James Allardyce, and he'd top and tail them, and it created the impression that he directed every single episode. Actually, he only directed a few of them, but it turned him into a celebrity and someone who had a sort of macabre but jolly personality. And I want to show you the clip, please. Alfred Hitchcock, first one. Okay, that's episode 6 of Alfred Hitchcock Presents. And I show you that for two reasons. One, he was very well known in summer 1966 when he gave this lecture. But secondly, the music. It was written by Gounod, Charles Gounod, the man who wrote Faust, written in the 1870s. And it's a jolly, macabre little party piece called The Funeral March of a Marionette. Anyway, Alfred Hitchcock gave this lecture, and I was a wide-eyed first-year student. And in the lecture, he said that his favorite film was Shadow of a Doubt, the film with Joseph Cotton as the Merry Widow murderer. And he told all his favorite stories, about how he'd been locked up in a police station at the age of 4, and that had given him a sort of paranoia about authority, about the fact that someone wrote to him after seeing the French film Les Diaboliques, which has a famous scene where a corpse gets up in the bath, suddenly sits up, it's not a corpse at all, And this person said, after I saw Les Diaboliques, I stopped having a bath. And after I saw Psycho, I stopped having a shower. What am I going to do now? And Hitchcock wrote back and said, I suggest you go to the dry cleaners. Anyway, so he told that story, which he'd told many times, and it was great, you know. And he ticked all the boxes, really, of his stories. And about being brought up by the Jesuits in Stepney, etc. And then after the lecture, he came out, and in those days, no press agents, no one surrounding him. He was being mobbed by the students, all of whom wanted his autograph and so on. He was over in England, by the way, to do a recce for Torn Curtain. And I found myself standing like that, with Alfred, absolutely next to him. And I don't know what possessed me, but I started humming the Alfred Hitchcock theme from Alfred Hitchcock. I went, bum, 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 like this. And he walked away. Then he turned back and smiled and said, sunrise. And I thought, okay, fine. And off he went to his Rolls Royce, which drove him away. I didn't know what he meant. It was like Rosebud, you know, in Citizen Kane. What could he have meant? And then about 40 years later, someone sent me the DVD of F.W. Murnau's film, Sunrise, made in 1927, which had the original soundtrack put on. This film came out 13 days before The Jazz Singer. It was the last of the silent movies, but the music track was actually recorded on film, and a version of it had survived. And so I played Sunrise, and I suddenly realized what Alfred Hitchcock meant. Can we have the second clip, please, the Sunrise clip? It's the farmer and his wife have gone to the big city, and they go into a photographer's studio and think that they've damaged a sculpture, which is actually Winged Victory without a head. Anyway, this is the thing. Okay, what Alfred Hitchcock was telling me was that that's where he got the music from. And what was so interesting about that was that Hitchcock, in fact, visited UFA Studios in 1924 to watch F.W. Murnau at work. In fact, his first two films were Anglo-German co-productions, The Pleasure Garden and The Mountain Eagle, which is now lost. And the influence of German filmmaking, silent filmmaking, on Hitchcock's work was profound. So not only did he get the tune from Sunrise, he also learned lots of other things as well. So it's, in terms of this bridge between thinking about film and interviews, my one-word interview with Hitchcock actually contained legions. My second clip, my first job after leaving university was as a film researcher at the Imperial War Museum. There'd been a great success with a TV series called The World at War, which some of you may remember, with lots of color footage of the Second World War, which was dug up from the archives. Although official film was all in black and white, a lot of home movies were found in color, which were used for the Thames television series. And one day, when I was working at the War Museum, I went to see a travel agent near Victoria to book a flight to Paris on business. And as I was booking the flight, and after I told the agent what I did for a living, he said, I happen to have 2 reels of old film in a rusting can up in the attic, which might have something to do with the First World War. Perhaps you'd be interested in taking a look at them. And actually, this sort of thing happened quite a lot, but usually the results turned out to be rather dull home movies. I mean, dull to the museum, at any rate, obviously of great value to the family. But for some reason, I followed this up when I got back and arranged to take the 2 reels to the museum. And we threaded them up on a Steenbeck, one of those flatbed machines for looking at viewing of celluloid in those days. And within seconds, we realized what they were. Now, do you remember in David Lean's film, Lawrence of Arabia, there's a journalist called Jackson E. Bentley, played by Arthur Kennedy, who follows Lawrence around and sort of creates the legend of Lawrence of Arabia. Now, he was based on a real-life person called Lowell Thomas. Lowell Thomas was a journalist, a filmmaker, and a showman who did a famous lecture about Lawrence of Arabia. In fact, he was the first to coin the phrase Lawrence of Arabia, a famous lecture in 1919, which created the legend of Lawrence. And when he gave this lecture in the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden, or the Royal Albert Hall, and he went on tour, actually, on a national tour, he had film extracts to illustrate the lecture. And these were thought to have been lost. Lowell Thomas was the only person who got access to Lawrence and his Arab army and the war in the desert. So his extracts were the only movie that existed of that time. There were stills, but no movie. And this footage turned out to be the visual aids that Lowell Thomas used in his lectures in 1919 about Lawrence of Arabia. So imagine our excitement as we threaded up the Steenbeck with this film and realized what we'd got. Originally, you have to imagine, this would have been accompanied by a band of the Welsh Guards playing, quote, atmospheric Eastern music to accompany it, arranged by Mrs. Thomas, with a spotlight on Lowell Thomas on the lectern. There would have been a Moonlight on the Nile set on the stage, recycled from a musical called Joseph and His Brethren. And the show would begin with a dance of the Seven Veils, and then a Muslim call to prayer sung by Mrs. Thomas, which of course no woman should ever sing. And then Lowell Thomas would stride onto the stage with a slide of Colonel Lawrence, uncrowned King of Arabia. He would say this: "At this moment, somewhere in London, hiding from a host of feminine admirers, book publishers, autograph fiends, and every species of hero worshipper, is a young man whose name will go down in history beside those of Sir Francis Drake, Sir Walter Raleigh, Lord Clive, Charles Gordon, and all the other famous heroes of Britain's glorious past. Come with me to lands of history, mystery, and romance, ladies and gentlemen." And then he showed this. And this is the film that the travel agent gave me, and that we discovered what it was when we played it. Next clip, please. It's silent. But you've got to... It's not just that these were the visual aids from Lowell Thomas's film, but that Lawrence is so camera shy. He really doesn't like being filmed. Of course, in the David Lean film, he's turned into a kind of 1960s style celebrity who absolutely loves the camera and plays up to it and all sorts of tricks to enhance his image. But in real life, he didn't like all that at all. So that's so interesting. The other is that extraordinary shot of Faisal getting all his counselors to sit down so they can stand up when Lawrence comes to visit them, which is really a remarkable thing. Anyway, the War Museum was absolutely delighted to have found this. They then went back to their archive and discovered that, unbeknown to them, they had the negative of this, but they didn't know what it was. It was unlabeled, and my clip enabled them to identify this piece of film that had been there since 1919, and they now realized was Lowell Thomas's negatives. That's number 2. Number 3, changing the subject. I mentioned earlier the seasons of films that used to be shown on BBC television, the films of a director or actor, long before Channel 4 and long before extras on DVDs and streaming and all sorts of other ways in which such things happen. And so those seasons are a thing of the past. But on the 5th of January 1989, I got the opportunity to interview Doris Day, who had never given a career interview in her life. She'd become a recluse. As I say, she ran this dog's home in Carmel, California. She wanted the interview to take place at the Cypress Inn, Carmel, which she co-owned with her son, Terry Melcher. And she was happy to talk about her 20-year career, 39 films from the late 40s to the late 60s, provided we spent quite a lot of time talking about dogs as well. The other thing she insisted was that the cameraman had to be a man called Dick Rawlings, who had shot Dynasty and the Doris Day television show, because he knew how to light her. And he really did a remarkable job, actually. There was a myth that Doris Day films had gauze over the lens, to create soft focus. It's not true, but he put a light beside her with an open window. He put a light on the other side. He put a light behind her so she had a halo. Hardly any light on her face at all, except a pin light for her eyes. And that was it. And it created this extraordinary kind of soft focus apparition with a halo. Dick Rawlings certainly earned his money that day. How I got the interview was extraordinary. Many people had tried and written to her and couldn't get past her agent. And eventually, I wrote on Royal College of Art headed notepaper with the Royal Coat of Arms on it. Whether it was the animals, I don't know, or whether she thought she was getting the OBE or something. Anyway, she agreed and said, would we come over and do the interview? And what was so interesting about this interview, and this is what the clip shows, I think, is that she didn't know the rules, that she hadn't given interviews, so she hadn't developed a repertoire of stories and anecdotes. And it was very raw, actually, some of the interview. She was really giving me her emotions and how that sunny exterior masked a really very complicated woman underneath. In fact, there were moments in the interview where she was nearer Judy Garland territory than Doris Day territory. And that was very, very refreshing. I mean, I expected a rather professional, sort of smooth interview, but it wasn't like that at all. She kept bursting into tears, and she had a box of Kleenex, and it was a hell to cut this because the Kleenex kept popping up and down and all the rest of it. It was very difficult to bring the clips together. Anyway, her career went into three phases, really. Firstly, Warner Brothers from the late 40s, where she made a series of 17 films, mainly musicals, 1948 to 1955. And then from 1955 to 7, as an independent actress, Hitchcock and Love Me or Leave Me, a film made in, I think, 1955 with James Cagney. She was the only actress ever to appear above the name of James Cagney on the credits. And she plays a torch singer called Ruth Etting. He plays a gangster called Marty Snyder, who's horrible to her. And it triggered in the conversation the terrible time she'd had with her first two husbands, who had abused her. And this suddenly came out, and you'll see in the interview, it's quite a moment, actually. So I want to start with Love Me or Leave Me, this film made in the mid-50s when she first became an independent actress. The final phase of her career was when she became a comedienne with a series of films with Rock Hudson and James Garner, and that was the sort of Barbie doll period. But let's go back to the mid-50s and have the next clip, Cagney and Doris Day. Yeah, and I let the moment pass. I should have made something of that, really, but I said, they don't get slapped around in Doris Day movies very often, which is true. But there were moments like that where she really wanted to talk about quite deep things in her life, and it made it a very, very interesting interview. Now, in the 1990s, I became, through my connections with the Royal College of Art, I became very interested in production design and flying the flag for production designers through publications and programs and things. And I got to know very well Ken Adam, born Klaus Adam, who was, as I said at the beginning, best known for the design of 7 James Bond films between Dr. No in 1961 and Moonraker in 1979, by which time the Adam style had become integral to the Bond DNA. It had become just what everyone expected. And what's interesting about the Bond films is that you can trace his development as a designer from a lowish budget thriller in 1961 to a global event with huge budget, from illustrating a ready-made script to being a key contributor to the script from You Only Live Twice in 1965 onwards, where he actually helped to write the scenes inside the volcano with the missiles and so on. That was Ken's contribution. They needed a big set. He slightly resented always being associated with Bond to the exclusion of the rest of his work, because the rest of his work really did include some of the grandest illusions in the history of cinema. The War Room in Dr. Strangelove, the London Warehouse, which looks like an Eastern European prison in the Ipcress file, 1965, the English baronial hall full of tricks, mechanical dolls, and automata in Sleuth, 1972, the country house interiors and locations in Barry Lyndon, 1975, with Kubrick. The weird gingerbread Gothic interiors belonging to Morticia and Gomez in Adam's Family Values, 1992, I think. And The Madness of King George, which expanded Alan Bennett's play to an Oscar-winning film. So he had an enormous range, had joined the industry in 1948, and was still working up to his 90th birthday. And that's just a selection of the more than 70 films and 15 unrealized film projects he worked on between 1948 and 2002. And his big specialism was giving us glimpses of off-limits worlds we would never otherwise see, Fort Knox or the War Room underneath the Pentagon, whatever. Whether there is one or not, it created this. He's taking you into worlds you'd never otherwise see, and they were often sinister worlds, and they tended to be much larger than life. He's the only production designer ever to have been honored with a knighthood. He's the only one to have been the subject of a major exhibition at a London art gallery, the Serpentine. Normally, art galleries are much too snobbish to put on exhibitions of production design. I've been beating on the door for years, but they find it very difficult to cope with that thought. And he's also been credited by eminent architects in the real world, Norman Foster and Daniel Libeskind among them, as an inspiration for architecture outside the movies. So as you enter a soaring office atrium or escalate down to a cavernous subway with exposed engineering, or travel between airport terminals, or as you look at Foster's Gherkin building, which resembles a space rocket with the top nose cone of a Second World War fighter on the top, think of where those might have originated. A lot of them were inspired by the sets of Ken Adam. His life was, as Roger Moore once said, every bit as thought-provoking and exciting as the best of his films, and in some cases, more so. Born in Berlin in 1921, Jewish family, got out of Germany in 1934, came to London, studied at the Bartlett College, apprenticed to an architect, and then a fighter pilot, flying Hawker Typhoons, D+1, the day after D-Day, across his home country in 1944. One of only 2 fighter pilots in the RAF to have a German passport. So, of course, had he been shot down, he'd have been shot as a spy immediately. And then to London, and then to Malibu, and finally back to London. And he died in March 2016, shortly after his 95th birthday. And I got to know him quite well for about 30 years. I brought him into the Royal College to lecture architecture students on his film designs, and had fascinating discussions about the connections between movie production design and design in the real world. And I want to show you some of Ken Adams' greatest hits in a compilation which I put together with technical help from Eon, the Bond production company, for his memorial at London's National Film Theatre on the South Bank in June 2016. It begins with Ken talking about his work in a facsimile of his office, which was put together for an exhibition in Berlin, and then goes through a lot of his achievements. See how many you can spot. It ends with some of the darker aspects of his work. Okay, the work of Ken Adam, a production designer. And a curator at the Museum of Modern Art in New York wrote about him, saying, Ken Adam conjured a celluloid universe where he exorcised the evil spirits of his youth. I mean, clearly, a Jewish family getting out of Germany in 1934, Berlin in the 1920s. It was an odd thing for someone to spend their life designing Führer bunkers in film when they'd been through that personal experience. And Ken was prepared to admit that films of the 1920s, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari or Metropolis, had a very strong influence on his aesthetic. You know, that in Dr. No, that spider's web ceiling, etc., is straight out of German Expressionism. But he wouldn't accept that there was any deep connection at a conscious level or an exorcism going on in his life on the dark side of his design. So we spent a whole book actually arguing about this. And it's an example of bringing thoughts from within the literature to discussions, but he wouldn't have it. I still think there must have been something going on because it's a very odd way to earn a living for someone who's been through those experiences. Final clip, an exhibition I did in 2004 called Once Upon a Time in Italy about the Italian Westerns. It had costumes, sets, drawings, graphics. The problem with film exhibitions so often is that they're really exhibitions of graphic design, you know, posters and clips. And you've got to somehow approximate to the live experience of going to the pictures. And so to bring three-dimensional objects in, but also how you use the clips and how the drama of the journey through the exhibition is, for me, very, very important. And we tried to do that in Once Upon a Time in Italy. And as part of it, I wanted, as the climax, an interview with Clint Eastwood. He was happy to do it, and off we went to his bungalow at his company called Malpaso on the Warner Brothers lot. And I sat in the anteroom, and there was a shelf of books. And I thought, oh, this is great. I hope my book's going to be there. You know, every single book was about golf. And I thought, that's really interesting. Again, it's that point about it may be the most important thing in the world to us to hear about the back numbers, but it's not necessarily the most important thing in the world. His leisure hours are spent playing golf rather than being a movie buff. So I was a bit disappointed. There was also a letter from Ronald Reagan in a frame thanking Clint Eastwood for allowing him to use Make My Day as part of an election campaign from one of the Dirty Harry movies. Anyway, in came Clint Eastwood wearing, rather improbably, a corduroy jacket. And I was quite surprised. And then I only realized in retrospect he'd come straight off the set of a film called $1 Million Baby, where he plays a boxing trainer. And in a scene with the priest, he's wearing this costume. He'd come straight off the set, actually, in order to do the interview. So, final clip, me trying to talk to Clint Eastwood about Italian Westerns, where he has this immortal line about, that's the sort of question that the Cinematheque would ask. And I'd obviously overstepped the mark in what I was trying to ask him. Next clip, final clip, please. Okay, that's me put in my place. But anyway, so I hope you've enjoyed this whistle-stop tour of some of my real conversations, my encounters, a sort of oral history of things I've been up to since leaving university. I'm delighted to take questions. I just wanted to finish on Walter Benjamin's quote, which I started with. It's not so much a question of how it really was, but who is to take control of the memory and why. Thank you very much.